Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Lee Artz. I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Moñica Reyes, to discuss immigration, migration, and the U.S. asylum system. Dr. Reyes is an assistant professor of rhetoric and cultural rhetoric at DePaul University. She earned her Ph.D. from Old Dominion University in Virginia. She's published on oral traditions, communication in the U.S. asylum process. Recently, she had a chapter published or forthcoming, Networks of Care, and a book on public rhetoric in local context. She also works with La Posada Providencia, which is an emergency shelter for refugees in Texas, which I hope we'll be able to talk about today. So welcome. I guess my first question is, why do people want to come to the United States?
Sure. And that's a very big question that migration scholars, much smarter than me, have been studying for years and years. But basically, there's push and pull factors, right? Bringing people to the U.S. border. So we can talk about economic, right, sort of push factors that are, making it very difficult for people to earn a living wage in their home countries, right, to feed their families. Then you add, violent and corrupt governments, right, maybe even a town that's been overrun by gang members, right, and make it hard for just an everyday business owner to make a living for their family. So they have to seek protection and survive somewhere.
Well, you kind of opened the door to my next question.
Sure.
Is what are some of the more concrete conditions or motivations that would prompt migration? I mean, you mentioned conflict. Mm-hmm. We also know that there's climate, right, which isn't always caused by the country that people are coming from, but if there's droughts or floods, like mm-hmm. recently there were floods in Honduras, so the big part of sections of Honduras, and you can't go to your home, you can't go to your field, you can't go to work, so what do you do? So what are some of the other conditions that may prompt somebody? Because people generally don't want to leave their home and their families, but we have thousands of people at the U.S. border wanting to be let in.
I think your question sheds light on how there's not distinct factors. I think if you speak to people who are, in the asylum system right now in the U.S., the reasons for them coming are sort of intermixed, right? So someone who is facing extreme poverty because they've been their business has been taken over by corrupt gangs, right? So there's a multitude of reasons overlapping that often stem from corrupt governments unable and unwilling to take care of their own citizens.
To protect the population.
Right. Yeah. And then that problem will just get compounded in the case of a natural disaster, for example, where the government is not even running and functioning in a way for their own citizens to do well. And then you have a disaster come in and it's devastating to the community, right? And so if you mix in, crime, poverty, and then climate issues, a lot of people you'll talk to who are in the system can't articulate one specific reason mm-hmm. without mentioning all the other overlapping factors that they're facing.
This must create a problem for people seeking asylum, because the asylum process is not where you sit down with some sympathetic ear and then you explain to them your conditions. There's certain regulations and expectations, and it may even depend on which border agent you run into or which judge you get the hearing in front of. Could you talk a little
Absolutely.
bit about the current U.S. asylum process?
Sure, and this is a process that changes often and arbitrarily. So even now this summer, there was a dramatic change to the actual flow of asylum, someone in the system. So when someone, let's say, presents themselves at the border, they have an opportunity to share the reason why they're seeking asylum in the U.S., right? And so under international law, that reason has to be based on their fear of persecution by being part of a social group because of their faith, right? Because of their political opinion, and those are the main reasons why
those are the main legal reasons.
The legal
so somebody
reasons.
that says, I no longer have a piece of property that I can live in and the area is flooded and I need to, that's not a legitimate reason.
That would not be under asylum, right? So, so coming here and telling your story in a compelling, right, and credible way can be very stressful, because that person is usually used to living in secrecy out of fear, you know, to keep themselves alive. On their journey to the border, they may have been exploited by the cartel. They may have even faced kidnap or rape, right? And so they're under an intense amount of trauma already. They've sort of conditioned themselves to keep quiet about their identity, about who is persecuting them. And then suddenly they're thrown into a system where telling their story is part of saving their life.
To somebody in a uniform.
To somebody in a uniform, right?
Yeah.
And so they may have come from a community where they can't trust people in uniform, right? So through my work at the shelter along the South Texas border, I've met many people, not just from Honduras or Nicaragua, but you know, people use the southern border of the United States from all over the world, right? So for example, the shelter that I was a volunteer at and I did my research at, many of the people staying there were from Africa, right? And
We would not expect that.
no, absolutely not. A lot of people were from Haiti.
I wanted to interrupt you, Dr. Reyes, I'm sorry, but back to my first question about why the U.S. I mean, in part, it makes sense. If I'm in Central America or Latin America, it's a, you know, you go north and there it is. But when you say people from Africa are ending up at the border coming in, it's just like, why wouldn't they go to France or to Italy? Or, I mean, what's the motivation for those people to take a journey across the ocean and then still have to face the asylum process? Is there something that they know that the rest of us don't know, or something that they believe that other people are not believing of?
Well, a lot of people who make that, you know, very treacherous journey, right, over the Atlantic, and they are trying other, like, European countries, for example, right? It all comes down to what they can afford from the smuggler who is helping them, right? Or if they know someone who's traveling this way to the U.S., they'll, you know, group together, right, for safety reasons. So it's really about what they can afford, what's available at the time, that they'll seize that opportunity. And also the U.S., like most European nations, are part of an international agreement, right, where people can seek
You're
asylum.
supposed to have that human right to asylum.
Exactly, right.
Yeah.
And so this is part of their international right to at least petition, right, for asylum.
So the second thing that comes to my mind when you're talking about the asylum process is climate conditions and personal conditions, economic conditions aren't legally accepted currently. You have to be able to prove persecution. So if someone goes through this process and they're denied, is that the source of people that want to cross not through the gates where there's an official looking at you, but you've already been through that process, you were denied, but I still can't go back to where I came from, I have to get into the US, so I'm going to climb the wall, or whatever the process is. Is that part of the kind of the fallback?
The short answer is yes, right? People are going to find a way to be safe and to keep their children safe, right? And so if they have an opportunity to stay in the U.S., right, and it's through the U.S. asylum system and they have credible reasons, right, then
and that works out. That
works out.
That's fine.
Great. However, I will note that it's getting more unclear, these limits on asylum, how it impacts someone's personal reason to come. For example, during the Trump administration, the Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, reversed a decision on a case for a particular asylum case. A woman who was seeking asylum because she had been facing domestic abuse for years. And no matter where she traveled in her country, her husband would find her. And so when she would seek out help from the government, it was no help because they were corrupt, right? And women there are treated as second-class citizens.
Issue, yeah.
So it became unclear that if her affiliation with a certain group, being women, was going to hold up in court as, a valid reason for asylum. And when her case was heard and she was, granted asylum, the Attorney General at the time, who has the power to reverse asylum decisions, did just that, right? And so it even though that was such a negative effect on that one person's case, it brought to light how asylum is not a black and white, very clear-cut issue, that it's really about listening to people's stories. And when you listen to someone's story, you'll see that those reasons, we think about political persecution, religious persecution, and how crime fits in with their story, that it just begins to get fuzzier and fuzzier, right? And there's a real value in listening to stories to help understand what are some solutions, right, to, migration, right, that is causing a lot of headaches for legislation or host communities, right? So it's really important that we stop and listen to people.
I'm interested because you're a rhetorician and you teach rhetoric and cultural rhetorics. It seems almost like that the border officials and the judges need some courses in rhetoric to be able to unpack the stories that people are telling. So when you hear the stories, mostly we're hearing stories of women that were in the shelters, which is something we should also talk about a bit, but what kind of stories are being told that seem to have credibility, that seem to be, something that you should act on to protect these people?
So as far as stories that seemed credible to the powers that be in the U.S. asylum system, what is really unfortunate is that people who had medical, credibility, maybe they had scars from bullet wounds or knife wounds, those were, immediately seen as more credible than people who had more invisible scars, right? Let's say they were, their daughters were kidnapped and there's nothing on their own bodies to prove that kind of persecution. So while, the credibility is certainly, the need for credibility can certainly be problematic, there are people who bear sort of these physical scars that help them in that time of having to tell their stories. At the same time, a lot of the women who bear these scars are, like I said, so used to hiding them because of the kinds of communities they come from where they're ostracized. For example, just mentioning earlier how one woman I interviewed who was from Africa, she was so used to, in her particular community, in her rural village where she was from, at not speaking about, sexual violence that was occurring, because speaking about sex even to your family members was seen as taboo, right? So she couldn't speak openly about the persecution she was facing from the government. And so when she came here, having to tell that story, like you said, to someone in uniform who is most likely male.
Is that the only way that you can tell the story? There are no special services where you can tell your story and then they can testify, yes, Your Honor, I've seen the scars, she has the scars. But the woman would actually have to show her body to an agent or
That's
a judge.
Right. And I've actually met people who refuse to their lawyers to show their scars, but only on the repeated advice of counsel, showed, because that was sort of their best line of stating their case. And so women who would often use silence to survive, it was a complete reversal, right, in their in their own rhetorical performance, right? And so I think there's not enough time for, to appreciate this tremendous stress that people are under to tell stories in these circumstances that will save their life. And then another part of storytelling is the written portion, right, which has to be submitted in English. So you can only imagine the other hurdles that they face, right? Getting help, translating. I've met women at the shelter where they were illiterate in their home community. So even in their own native language, they didn't read or write. And then coming here and having to write out their story in English was incredibly difficult.
So you keep mentioning the shelters, and I kind of understand that the shelter is an alternative, response or alternative part of the process to getting asylum, because you don't go into detention, you don't go into prison, but you can go to the shelter. How many shelters are there, and how many people can shelters serve?
Right, so it all depends. So for example, the shelter that I was volunteering at, I think it had a capacity of 25, and that's if you had some sleeping, blankets on the floor, but comfortably about 20. And so in Texas, there was, I believe, roughly about 15 shelters, and they would sometimes not be used as alternatives to detention, but be used as sort of the place you go after detention at the time under that administration during about 2017 through 2019. And so people exiting detention would find a place of solace there. There was often a community of healthcare workers, social workers, some pro bono legal teams would connect with the shelter to offer their services.
But that's still a very small portion of the people that can be in a shelter, which seems like a safer place and also a more accommodating place than one of the other locations that you might be basically imprisoned in. So
right, absolutely.
And there's no funding when the Biden administration or somebody talks about an increase in funding to deal with immigration at the border. It certainly doesn't carry money for shelters or the increase of shelters or the increase of beds. It's probably more for the enforcement side.
Exactly, and so in the area that I'm from, and the part of the South Texas border known as the Rio Grande Valley, during the time I was doing my research, about 2017 to 2019, had the highest border crossings, right, by Border Patrol apprehension statistics. They only had 2 shelters there. At the same time, a lot of people that, go through the southern border seeking asylum, they don't stay particularly long in the area that they crossed over into, so places like Arizona, Texas. And so what's interesting about that is, Operation Lone Star, for example, that's busing people to,
Governor
sanctuaries.
Abbott sending people to Chicago, Illinois,
Exactly. A lot of this is a boon to people seeking asylum because they were headed to these destinations anyway. So in a way, it backfired. And if you speak to a lot of volunteers at these shelters, they'll say, this is great. We don't have to raise money for a bus ticket for them to go see their abuelita or their cousins.
But it also certainly had some political fallout, both positive and negative, I would suggest.
Right.
I want to move to something that's slightly different because I hope that we have time to talk about what kind of policies need to be put in place to make the asylum process more humanitarian and also more legal. But it seems that there's a relationship between public opinion and what those possible federal policies will be, which leads me to ask, what's the effect of media images and stereotypes and representations? I mean, you talked earlier about a crisis or illegal, and those things seem, they seem descriptive, but by the very description, they're suggesting some meaning that has to have its effect on the public.
Absolutely. So typically when we hear about, the immigration crisis at the border, we see pictures of hundreds of people, camped out on bridges.
Caravans, they're coming.
The caravans are coming. They're going to take over your city. And so, people who are seeking asylum are often criminalized, right, with the word illegal. And so, I've learned that by classifying someone as illegal, even though they're exercising their international right to petition for asylum, and it's totally legal, then people are able to associate whatever crimes they think those people are capable of, be it rape, right, or drug trafficking. And so that just adds to the, the negative imagination, right, about these people.
Which means they don't want to get money for shelters, but they want to get money for more border patrol or for a higher wall.
Right.
Because this is my understanding, these are illegals, and there's a crisis at our border.
Right, exactly. And so these deterrence policies are really not going to solve the root causes, right, of migration. But another thing that I want to mention about this, media representation of people seeking asylum is that often you'll find that in the media they're depicted as burdens, right? In addition to being criminals, And
They may be victims, but they're burdens. They're going to be a burden on the state.
Right. They're incapable
Health
of
system
caring
that-
for themselves in their own country. There's this myth, well, why doesn't their own country take care
Yeah.
of them? You know, that as if that's so simple to solve. But also this combination of being a burden and being a criminal, it's something that nobody wants in their host communities, obviously, right? So part of changing the narrative, I think, is listening to their stories, listening to their strengths. And this is actually something I do with my students at DePaul. One of the graduate courses that I teach, we actually work with shelters. Last time I taught the course, we worked with the shelter in South Texas virtually, and my students partnered with clients there at the shelter, and they got to hear stories of resilience, stories of their talents, right? And it was helping to change that narrative that we hear so much, right? And when I teach the course again in the winter, we'll actually be partnering with the shelter in Chicago. So I'm really excited about
Excellent.
that.
So when we talk about the current conditions of the asylum process, what kind of policy that goes beyond detention or beyond refusal or beyond not accepting your story as credible, what kind of policies can you envision being necessary to make the migration more humane?
Right. So if the asylum system is going to continue using the very clear-cut persecution based on social group, religion, right, sort of definition, I think it's important to open up a legal work permit program for economic immigrants. I think that is so necessary, because I think people who hear at any time that, you know, someone seeking asylum also is poor, also, you know, wasn't doing well in their home country, they want to label them an economic migrant or a queue jumper, a line jumper, right? Using or, you know, cheating the system. So I think it's important to maybe have a separate category in our, you know, hopefully one day immigration overhaul that will specifically speak to people who want to come and work here, you know, legally, and have a place for them, right, to not have to hide.
Yeah.
And be part of our communities and invest in our communities here. Because research has shown that for every asylum seeker that we do welcome, we add about $19,000 a year to our own economy. So over years and over thousands of people that we welcome, that's billions of dollars, right? So I think there's definitely a place for that.
When we hear about crisis or illegal aliens at the border, it's like, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? And even if somebody's sympathetic to the information that you've provided, what can individuals do? I mean, where can they go? They could take your graduate class and work with a
Right.
with a shelter, but beyond that, I mean, they can volunteer where? Are there solidarity groups? Are there immigrant rights groups?
Absolutely.
Are they in driving distances?
So the great thing about what happened during COVID was a lot of organizations like nonprofits that work with displaced populations are now open to, you know, accepting virtual volunteers, which I think is fantastic. So you might find organizations all over the country that you could help teach English virtually, right, to the clients that they're serving in that specific city. But in Chicagoland, you know, there's Refugee One, right? There's the Heartland Alliance. And so there's plenty of organizations that Centro Romero is another one because of Chicago's reputation as a sanctuary city. But, you know, even going past, you know, volunteering, which I'm always an advocate for, is thinking about, you know, how you're voting and you know, thinking about the kinds of legislation you want to see happening, you know, even dreaming about what that can look like and speaking to your own, you know, state representatives about that, right, as a collective with other like-minded people, I think is a step in the right direction.
Okay. That's all the time we have for our program today. Thank you, Dr. Moñica Reyes, for joining me on the Roundtable Perspective. I'm Lee Artz. I'll see you next time.